And you are podcasting with Gary DeMar. Let's figure things out.
It's not always easy to determine what a Bible passage means. And part of that problem, I think, is as Christians, we've never really been trained to interpret the Bible. We have become dependent on maybe what the preacher says or what some favorite Bible teacher says. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but one of the things, if you're going to really grow in terms of your understanding of the Bible, is to know how to go about interpreting the Bible. And I think that's true of anything. Anybody who's learning a new field of study has to study the elements of that particular field of study. And we've done this all of our lives, some greater than others. If you're going to study music, you're going to have to know every aspect of music, and if you really want to be great at it, you're going to have to practice it all the time. But many of us, of course, don't have the time to do all that. But there's some basic things that we as Christians need to get straight right from the start in terms of reading and studying the Bible. And I have a short kind of course on hermeneutics that is available, and I'll make that available to you. There'll be a link to it in this particular podcast, and to take you through some of the things. But what I want to focus in on just a couple of elements based upon some questions that I've gotten regarding the particular passage. But the first thing I want to do is to kind of take you into the process of how you can do Bible study on your own. And one of the things I learned this very, very early. I became a Christian in 1973 and ended up going providentially down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and providentially moving within a few blocks of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, and then providentially studying briefly under D. James Kennedy, who was a really great Bible teacher and also a student of Scripture, had a huge library. And one of the things is kind of funny. I graduated from college, and my graduation from college, my degree, got me a custodial job at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. And it was at Coral Ridge that I became interested in the Christian faith, especially in the area of apologetics. And one of the tasks I had, of course, was on Saturday. I spend most of my time getting the sanctuary ready for church the next day. And also one of the things I had to do was to go up into Dr. Kennedy's library, which was high up in the tower of Coral Ridge. If you've ever been to Coral Ridge, or go online and look at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's a beautiful library, and it was my interest in study. But it really came down to a really very simple process in studying the Bible. And the first thing you have to do is kind of get an idea of how the whole Bible is put together, and that means learning Genesis through the book of Revelation. Essentially, the history of the Bible, the movement of history through the Bible, because the Bible is a book of history, unlike the book of the Quran or anything like that. Christianity is very, very unique, that Christianity is rooted in historical reality. Things actually took place in history, and there are names and there are places and there are dates, and you have to kind of get an idea of all of that. Now, that's a lifetime process, and we're not going to be able to, accomplish all of that. And then the next thing, you learn the particulars, what each book of the Bible is all about. And in doing so, you can start comparing Scripture with Scripture. Oh, I read this in this particular book. I read this in this particular book. And so it becomes comparing Scripture with Scripture. And again, I outline all this in this brief hermeneutics interpretation course that we'll make available to you. But then you get down to specific texts of Scripture. And we often hear texts out of context. We learn to memorize the Bible, which again is a good thing. And we oftentimes are taught in terms of what specific texts have to say. That's a good thing. But sometimes, most of the times, I would say, we really don't get into studying that text for ourselves. We leave it to others to tell us what that text means or says. And sometimes, at first reading, we read a text within the context of some overall interpretive system that we've grown up with. And as a result of that, we don't really see the element of what's behind that text. So when I was down at Coral Ridge, this was back in 1973, I was a part of something called the Greenhouse, which was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and it was held at a home there I think it was every Tuesday night, if I recall. There would be dinner, and you can invite young people in. There were Bible studies and so forth, and it was run by Rennie and Virginia Schmidt, and that whole neighborhood was just packed with cars, and just young people were in Bible studies. It was really rather amazing. Met a lot of great people there at that time. And one particular young man, Neil Ganzel, who is now a pastor in a PCA church in Florida, was really a good student of the Bible. And I asked Neil, I said, how do you do this? What's the process of studying the Bible? And he said, I use a concordance. And of course, I didn't know what a concordance was. And a concordance is a list of nearly every single verse in the Bible and where that verse appears in the Bible based upon particular words. And so if you were to look up the word world, you would go in there and it would tell you where every verse where the word world appears in the King James Version of the Bible. And it's, so I said, hey, I see world here, and they said, look it up. I said, there's world that appears here and there and here and there and here and there and here and there. I want to see how the Bible uses the word world. But the thing of it is, especially those of you who use the King James Version and also other modern translations, you will find out that the word world is often, certain Greek words are translated as world, but they are different Greek words, and you don't know that if you're just reading an English version of the Bible. And so if you were to go to Strong's Concordance, you would look up the word world, and then you would see that that there'd be, for example, coming and the end of the world, Matthew chapter 24:3, shall be preached in all the world, Matthew 24:15, beginning of the world to this time, Matthew 24:21. And you would look up those words, and in English, each one of those verses, you will find the word world. And that was Strong's approach, the Strong's Concordance approach to interpreting in his concordance. Young's Concordance took a little different approach. It broke down, still using the King James Version, it broke down which Greek words were being translated as world. Strong's Concordance, it gave you, back to Matthew 24:3, there would be a number attached to it, in this case 165, and in Matthew 24:15, that was 24:15, that was translated as world, it would be a number 3,625, and then in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 24, you would see that the word world had a number of 2,889. So at the back of the Strong's Concordance, there was a dictionary, and then you could go and look at those numbers and to see what the actual Greek word was, and you could determine whether, what that particular Greek word meant, because it would give you a definition of that word. It was a very good system. A lot of people don't know that. They read their King James Version of the Bible, or New American Standard, or NIV, or ESV, or whatever the case might be. There are dozens and dozens of them. And oftentimes you don't know the word, the Greek or Hebrew word behind a word, and it may be important in interpreting that verse based upon what that word is. Now, most of us do not know Greek, and we don't know Hebrew, and there's a smattering of Aramaic in the Bible as well. We don't grow up learning that. But if you're going to be a Bible student and be serious about studying the Bible, you don't necessarily have to go to seminary or learn to speak and read Greek, but it is helpful to at least be familiar with what words are being translated. In this case, we're using the word world. Now, Young's Concordance does it a little differently. If you pick it up and look up the word world, it will break down each use of it in terms of what the actual Hebrew or Greek word is. And so when you go to Young's Concordance, you will find in Young's Concordance that there may be more than this, but there are 10 different words behind or how the King James translates something into world. And the 10th one is the Greek word oikumene. And it's the 10th listing here has habitable earth or land, oikumene, and it's written out in Greek and written out, transliterated into English. And it lists Matthew 24:14, Luke 2:1, Luke 4:5, Acts 11:28, Acts 17:6, Acts 17:31, Acts 19:27, Acts 24:5, and also you'll find it in the book of Revelation and other places. But for our study here, it's important for us to note that, number one, Strong's Concordance gives 3 different Greek words that are translated world in the King James Version of the Bible. So that Matthew 24:3, you find the word world, but you don't find the Greek word cosmos. You find the word aeon, but it's translated as world. And then you get to Matthew 24:14, and it is, again, the Greek word is oikumene, but it's still translated as world. And then you get to Matthew chapter 24:21, you find that the word there is now cosmos, but it's still translated as world. What Young's Concordance does, it breaks down and gives you a whole list of where oikumene is used and how it's translated. Now, one of the interesting things I noticed this in looking at Young's translation of the number 10, the habitable earth, and I saw in Luke that oikumene is used in Luke 2:1, Luke 4:5, but I also noticed that he doesn't list Luke 21:26, and I know Luke 21:26 uses the Greek word oikumene, but the thing is, the King James translates oikumene in Luke chapter 21:26 as earth. Now there is a Greek word for earth; it's gay or geis. Sometimes translated as land, sometimes translated as soil, some translated as dirt, sometimes translated as earth. But in the King James Version, Luke 21:26 is translated as earth and not as inhabited earth, or not as Roman Empire, whatever the case might be. So it's very important that you kind of know what's going on behind the scenes when you're trying to interpret something, because it becomes important when discussions come up about how a verse might apply to contemporary prophetic thought. So when you come across the word oikumene in Matthew 24:14, the only place oikumene is found is that significantly important. And you say, well, where else is oikumene found? So you go to Luke chapter 2:1, and in Luke 2:1 it says that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole world be taxed. And then you say, well, wait a minute, that's the word oikumene. And you start thinking, well, Rome couldn't tax the whole earth, but it would only be able to interpret what we find here in Luke's gospel with the Roman Empire. So I really believe that Matthew 24 of 14 is crucial in understanding the interpretation of what Jesus says in Matthew 24 14 about the gospel being preached in the whole world. Now, this came up in a kind of a Facebook exchange in a few weeks ago, and somebody had made the comment, of course, that we're still waiting for the gospel to be preached in the whole world, because that is a clue as to when Jesus is going to return, because the gospel has to be preached in the whole world based upon Matthew 24 14. We're not there yet, so Jesus can't be coming yet. And just as a side note here, I think this is one of the problems with mission work today, because most mission work today is out there just to preach the gospel to people. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, it's a very good thing, but it's the first step into something greater, and that's the application of the Bible to all areas of life. So we spend most of our missionary dollars and efforts just taking the gospel to people, but we do not spend time explaining how the Bible applies to every area of life, in the area of education and politics and economics and art and music and everything else. Some people may do that, but for the most part, they don't. And I have to say, the same is true of what takes place in the United States. We're still looking at missionary work here domestically and also in foreign lands, and say, hey, we've got to get the gospel out to the whole world, because once we do that, Jesus is going to return. No, that's not what Jesus was saying in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14. A person named Chris made some comment about how Matthew 24 had not been fulfilled yet. How could anybody believe that Matthew 24 was already fulfilled, he said. And so my question was, I said, Chris, who are the you in Matthew 24? They're the ones in Jesus' audience. The judgment was local and could be escaped on foot. Flat roofs, cloaks, Sabbath regulation, first century fulfillment before their generation passed away. This is the response I received from Chris. He says, no. Matthew 24:14, the New King James Version he quotes from, says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So that was his response to my point that Matthew 24 had in fact been fulfilled. And then he quotes this particular verse, essentially saying that can't be the case because the gospel had not been preached in all the world. Now, if we go back to the concordance, especially Young's, which makes it much easier than does Strong's, but both of them come to the same conclusion based upon the definitions that are given. This was the response that I gave to him, and here's what I said. Yes, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the oikumene, not cosmos, as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? The end of the age, as the New King James Version translates the Greek word aionos. And so the original King James translates aionos as world, but the New King James gets it right and translates it as age. And so was the gospel preached to all the oikumene before that generation passed away? And I continued, it was. How do we know? Because the Bible tells us that it was. Oikumene is used in Luke 2:1 and refers to the then known world or the political boundary of the Roman Empire. Now, we know this. I'm adding this to what I actually wrote. We know this because of what we find in both Strong's Concordance and in Young's Concordance and in the definitions that they give, and all other lexicons give as well. Rome could only tax its empire. The famine in Acts 11:28 was not global. Again, world equals oikumene. That's the word that's used in Acts 11:28. King James and some other translations translate it as just world. But check out Romans 1:8, where the Greek word cosmos is used. Here's what Paul writes. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. Cosmos. The faith has been spoken throughout the whole world. And then see Colossians 1:6 and 1:23. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you have heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. Now, you might want to look at 1 Timothy 3:16. And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifested in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the cosmos, in the world, received up in glory. Paul goes so far as to say, but now the gospel is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith. Romans 16, verse 25. So then, it's important to understand the words that are used in Scripture. And the best way to do that is to become a little familiar with Greek, not so much Hebrew. Hebrew is not as specific as Greek is, and it's a little more difficult as a language to do. But there are Hebrew, English interlinears online. I use Bible Hub, but there are many others. It will give you the English. If you go to Bible Hub, it gives you an option here to click on the Greek. So if you went to Matthew 24:14, you'd see the English translation, you'd see the Greek translation. Plus, it would give you a link to the definition. So you can figure things out. It doesn't take long to learn the Greek alphabet. Most of it goes along very, very well with our English alphabet. There are a couple of letters that are different. The N is actually looks like a V. Of course, pi, the P is the symbol pi in math. The S is a little different. When S appears, sigma appears at the end of a word, it looks like an S. When it's in the interior of a word, it's a little different from that. It looks like an O with a little curl to it to the right. I is an I, T is a T, B is a B, A is an A. So it doesn't take much time in order to do that. If you have children, if you're homeschooling them, it would be great if they learned how to read Greek well enough so that they could use a Greek or an English-Greek dictionary and lexicons and so forth. So by putting all of this together, you can realize that it's important to see how words are used in the biblical text, because it helps to pinpoint the time element as well as the circumstances and the world which is being described in terms of your interpretation. And so I am going to supply a link to my little short course on hermeneutics. Plus, I'm going to send you the link to this particular podcast, the text I put together with this, that will appear in my book, The Prophecy Wars, which should come out in a few months.
Thanks for podcasting with Gary DeMar. Please subscribe and share this with anyone you think really needs to hear it.